refer to you as was. Hey, Shabbat Shalom, fam. Shabbat Shalom. Hope everybody is doing well on this beautiful Shabbat day. Everybody's here with me. The brothers are in the background. We have a very, very special guest with us today, Sister Wise Society. Sister, you say Shabbat Shalom to the fam. Can you guys hear me? How about now? Can you hear me?
Can anyone hear me? Because I can't. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I cannot hear you.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. I don't understand why I can't not hear.
They can hear us both. I'm not sure why you can't hear me though.
Microphone's there.
Okay, I'm glad they can hear us both.
I'm unable to hear you. I see that you guys can hear me. So I'm not really sure what's going on because I was able to hear you a minute ago.
Right, when we first started. Well, we got to get that
I'll
fixed.
go out and I'll come back in.
Okay, that'd be great, sis. Thank you so much. All right, so while she's going and getting that fixed, hopefully we could get that worked out. Again, thank you all for joining us on this Shabbat day. We have a special guest with us. When she gets back on, she'll be talking about the reparations, the resolution that was just passed in the United Nations. I hope you all saw that. It was in the news very recently. And as you all know, the news is going very fast nowadays. It's already out of the news. Pretty much it was probably in the news for a good solid week. And now it's already kind of out of the news and gone. But we're paying really close attention to it because it's something that's really important to us, something really important to our people. So we'll be talking today with Sister Christina, also known as Wise Society, who's going to tell us a little bit about how she got involved in looking at this particular resolution, why it came about, what's it about, and what she's done so far to address some of the inconsistencies that we already see in this resolution. There's a lot of inconsistencies there. There's a lot of things. She is back. Let's add her to the stage. Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. That was really interesting. I'll tell you that much.
It was because we were just on backstage and you were able to hear me fine, but this is good. I'm glad that you can hear me now. So I was saying, Sister Christina, Wise Society, introduce yourself to the fam.
Hi, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. I hope you're all having an amazing day so far of rest and peace. I am Christina Laster, a parent, a descendant of U.S. chattel slavery, obviously. We're having that discussion today. Professionally, I'm a policy and legislation expert and a family advocate who has done a lot of work around policy and laws across the nation when it comes to, families, child welfare, education policy. And so I'll stop there. But that's pretty much what my background has been career-wise. And I spent my life, around law and policy and advocacy for our families.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for that. I do want to know, how did you get involved? How did you get plugged in kind of the Washington, DC scene in terms of the people that you deal with on a regular basis? How did that come about?
So my advocacy for Black children and families is what led me to advocate towards the last administration, the Biden-Harris administration, and some of those previously, but really particularly the last administration, because they had an executive order um, targeting Black Americans. And so within that executive order, which was housed at the U.S. Department of Education under Miguel Cardona, Secretary Cardona, who was the U.S. Secretary of Education, I had a lot of ability to discuss the order with them, talk about, some of the issues that families were facing on the ground so that I could bring their policy agenda and priorities to life, right? A lot of times we see things codified and we know that those are the agendas, those are the stated priorities, but how will they affect people that are on the ground living with the experiences every day? And so I was able to bring those experiences to life, some cases that I had spearheaded in different states, talk about the impact on families and children, and talk about the intersection between education, child welfare services, family courts, and how those either benefit or divide Black families. And then part of that executive order dealt with economic opportunity and access, right? And so I was able to discuss, the ways that policies such as the Community Revitalization Act, actually harm us when we don't have the understanding of what is taking place with banking and the regulatory agencies. So that was some of the work that I did. And out of that, I, was able to, compare side by side the Black executive order priorities and what I worked with the Biden-Harris administration to make sure that our voices were heard through an impact brief that I, was able to produce. And I did get an award. It's not, it's not a celebratory moment, but at the same time, they thanked me for my excellence in bringing forward, our Black family and children's voices and staying consistent with it. So that's how I got involved. Once they left, I had realized that there was a lot more that needed to be done on the international level, because I recognized that there was a UN committee that was created around, the time that they were there, and a little bit before that too. There were some committees here and there, but there was a formal UN committee created by charter that dealt with racial discrimination, right? And that committee, for anyone that's watching, is CERD. So we have the committee at the UN that is dealing with elimination of racial discrimination. And what I recognized during that time was that there were a lot of meetings being had, policies coming out, recommendations and advisement, but nothing too targeted from our perspective as descendants of U.S. chattel slavery. And so I realized really fast that the discussion, the narrative, the projects, the evaluations, the resolutions coming out of that committee were very biased in the way that our voices weren't in them, and our arguments were kind of being able to be controlled and co-opted. I do know that there are some of the, what I'll just outright say, boule, sitting at the table, shaking hands and all of that, but they represented their interests and not everyday folks like me and you who are living through the conditions.
Right. That makes sense. Thank you for that, and thank you for explaining your background so that our audience knows. And we're not just grabbing somebody right off the street who has no idea what they're talking about. This is really your life's work. You've already kind of started to kind of dive into the resolution that was made. So what I want to do next is have you explain to our audience, what was this resolution? What is it? Why did it come about? How did it come about? Why now? And most importantly, and this is really a question for me, why the president of Ghana?
So if we look at the resolution the day it was signed on March 25th, right, that was an International Day of Remembrance. Okay. The International Day of Remembrance, you have this General Assembly meeting where Ghana, obviously proposes the resolution A-80-L.48 is otherwise known as the resolution to declare some things about slavery, being trafficking, one of them, and being a crime, another thing. So the resolution didn't just come with, the Ghana proposal. The third committee that I was just alluding to, that I found out the UN had, the Committee to Eliminate Racial Discrimination, was having discussions and evaluating, reparations for quite some times. And they did put calls out for, representation from states, meaning countries, because whenever you hear the word states referring to the United Nations, they're talking about countries. So they had put some calls out. We had 15 or so countries respond to that call. The US was not one of them. So they began to build off of those discussions between those countries or states as to what reparations framework should look like under the leading of the African Union, which...
Now, let me just stop you there because I just want clarification for something you said. You said the U.S. was not one of them.
No.
Now, is there a reason why the U.S. was not one of them? Did they just decline? How does that work?
So it depends on the administration that's obviously in office in the executive cabinet of the United States as to what their priorities are with bodies like the UN. You hear a lot about NATO, right? And you'll hear that on the news and the presidential stance on NATO. Some of his comments about NATO you've heard. But when it comes to committees such as this, the executive cabinet's function and relationship with the United Nations counts as to whether they're going to be willing to submit reports. What does that data show? It shows racial discrimination that continues to exist in the United States. That would have been the data needed to be provided to CERD last year, right? In order for the US to then have a voice with regards to the reparatory framework that they were building and the resolution that they subsequently announced at the General Assembly of the United Nations. And because the incoming administration did not submit the reports, it somewhat places them in a violation standpoint when it comes to CERD, right? Because if you don't follow the charter rules that you agree to with regards to your involvement, then you really don't have a say.
Okay. That makes sense.
So, the resolution, it actually does three things. The voted on now law, it names the crime, assigns the category of harm, and calls for a remedy. What we consider a remedy in law or a legal remedy is that if you have been harmed or injured in any way, then you can pursue justice in the form of a legal remedy. Obviously, some people will call that a civil tort claim, right? A lawsuit, right? That addresses that particular harm. Other times when you've been harmed in a way that a person committed a crime, then you'll see the criminal justice system pick that up as charges. Correct. Okay. So those are pathways to harm and remedy in law.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a few things the resolution does, and it states the transatlantic slave trade as the quote unquote gravest crime against humanity. specifically, like compared to other historical atrocities, is that a fair statement? How did that go? How did that jive with all of the quote unquote states in the United Nations?
So you have 123 that voted in favor of the resolution. So obviously they were okay with the language. You have 3 that voted no. So they rejected all of the paragraphs, words, sentences, dots, and crossed T's in the resolution. Just know that that was an outright rejection of everything stated in the resolution. And then you have a number of states that 50, right? Mainly comprised of the European Union, or what I would like to refer to as entities that are members of the G7, that abstained. And their abstention is not just silence either, right? It's more of we don't want to be involved in this in any way or linked. So we'll just go ahead and abstain, and hopefully this all blows over. But the US, Argentina, and Israel outright rejected everything stated. Now, the framing of Gravis actually forecloses on the minimization and comparison that, we see oftentimes happen, as if other atrocities equal this or equal that. Well, basically, when you use the word Gravis in a law like this, it does 2 things legally. It describes the severity of the crime that is stated as a crime now itself, and it forecloses on the comparative minimization, right? So you can't argue that slavery was the lesser harm when the international community has now voted 123 votes that it is the gravest atrocity that has existed. And so what it does is it provides the scale and the duration, and legal codification of it being a crime by that title, gravest.
Okay. All right. That makes
It
sense.
has no equivalent in recorded codified history. Just know that.
Okay. Okay. Is that somehow or in any way, shape, or form tied to the idea that in this new resolution, slavery is stated as a crime? Whereas, if we look back at some of the, and I'm sure you'll talk about this, some of the responses from even those that refrained from voting stated that this was not a crime or considered a crime at the time it happened. Does that have any kind of tie-in?
Well, those arguments are null and void when the majority voted yes, right? So even, they're null and void in the sense that the law has already been passed, right? The resolution is now international law. But they're not null and void, which we're going to go further into. When you look at the states or countries that voted no and rejected the resolution, and how they will not abide by the resolution or accept what the resolution is saying if you have member or citizen claims. Okay, so we want to make 2 designations. One, this is not just an aspirational statement like a mission or vision statement. This resolution now becomes international law, framing slavery as the greatest atrocity ever. 2, you have a rejection of this framing, and so how the citizens within those states that rejected it will be able to seek remedy from it is what we also need to consider. And we'll be having that conversation. I want people to understand, though, that framing it as the gravest, setting it as law, so it's not just an aspirational statement. It's not a hierarchy of suffering conversation. We eliminate that hierarchy of suffering conversation, right? So the acknowledgement of the scale and the scope, is what the resolution does do. And that's a good thing, right? We're not going to deny that that's what it does. So it doesn't say that other atrocities were insignificant. It says that slavery, chattel slavery in particular, because of the amount of people, the duration of suffering, and what atrocities were faced, is the gravest atrocity known to man. And it codifies that. So it's more than a memorial. Okay. So it makes it a law, a fundamental right, even.
Okay. That definitely makes sense. I want to talk a little bit too while we're on the topic of you kind of explaining what this resolution actually means and how it came about. The reparatory justice that's cited in the resolution, what does that mean? And in terms of we're talking about more than money, or they're talking about more than money, right? They're talking about artifacts, to some African countries and some other things that they see as reparatory justice. How would you frame that? How would you describe that if you're describing the resolution and what it's about? How
So
would
let
you
me
describe that portion?
so let me take a step back, because I think it's important that we have a measurement tool. So in 2001, there was a Durban Declaration, right? And that Durban Declaration had aspirational language in it, right? It stated that slavery should have been a crime, okay? Should have been. But what it does, but this particular resolution does more. It goes beyond that and says that slavery is a crime. Okay, so it goes beyond that aspirational language, or what we call in law, that's ambitious, right? If you can make that happen and actually have consequences come from it, that sounds ambitious. Good luck with that in court. Okay, so the Durban language was aspirational. It matters because the U.S. defense to reparations, it has always been that slavery was not illegal in any international body or any international system, or what could be known as international law governance structure, during the time that the U.S. had and kept chattel slaves. Okay, so I need people to understand that. That is the U.S.'s legal defense. Okay, which they stated that, like, slavery was not illegal in international law, and there was no international governing body to even say so during the time that they had chattel slaves. Okay, so I don't want to skip over that. And so in legal terms, this advances the Just Coggins argument, which some of you guys may have saw. Just Coggins argument is just basically saying that there is an international set of norms when it comes to law. Fundamental rights are those that you are born with and that you should die with. The right to be free, right? The right to have a family, the right to protect your family, the right to, have a good environment to live in, where you're not constantly under the threat of some kind of, I would say biochemical weapons being dropped on you, right? There are certain things that exist in international law that are known fundamentally, or what you can know just by being a person who is living, breathing, and walking around the earth. And so that's a set of norms that can exist and can be pointed to and known, whether those be through the ways and customs of societies prior to there being a formal entity such as the UN, or the way that people interacted with each other from country to country. These were things that were known and didn't need to be particularly codified in the national or federal or international sense and agreed upon. Everyone was born with these fundamental rights and should die with them. So that's one of the things I just wanted to step back towards. The resolution calls for reparatory justice in formal ways, right? So we're not asking for, people to give us a whole bunch of sound bites. Political sound bites is what I will call them, by saying, yeah, it was wrong. No, these are formal apologies, the return of artifacts, educational reform, it mentions, right? Financial compensation. It's one of those civil tort claim style remedies that I was talking about a little while ago, in the sense of if you are harmed, say for instance, even by way of a car accident, right? You have the right to pursue a legal remedy for that harm, which oftentimes comes through a way of financial compensation, right? So that's one of those things that's framed and baked into this law. And the guarantee of non-repetition, right? The guarantee of non-repetition. But here's the point where we must interject, because a formal apology from the U.S. government and the return of artifacts are not sufficient remedies for people who are descendants of U.S. chattel slavery, who were held as legal property codified by the U.S. in ways that other countries did not codify chattel slavery, whose destruction of family structure of our families was also codified, particularly by things like partis sequitur ventrum, being a Virginia colonial law that says that which follows the belly, meaning that the status of slavery or the condition of slavery was inheritable by the mother, right? So it sets up a matrilineal type of generational slavery. And, it doesn't specify that we are a formal and legally distinct group under U.S. law and need to be recognized as such, not just a part of this greater African diaspora or AU movement.
Okay, thank you for that. That makes sense. So, as you know, and as you all know, everybody listening in, there were specifically three countries that voted no to this. There were also about 50. Was there 50? How many?
50. Mm-hmm.
50 that abstained.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want you to explain to us this. What are the legal ramifications of that? I'm a country that abstained to vote. Are there any legal ramifications, since this has been passed by the UN, on me that would be imposed on me as a country that abstained to vote, did not vote? Also, at the same time, are there any legal ramifications for the three countries, the United States, Israel, and Argentina, that voted no?
Yeah, the U.S.'s objection is not just an objection of through by way of vote. It's them framing their legal argument, right? That retroactivity can exist because slavery was legal at the time. Then there is in by way of default is what they're saying. There was no international law forbidding it. There was no known law. And you know what? It was legal. So we're gonna object because we don't believe in the retroactivity of the resolution. Also, non-binding precedent. Again, that is what their main thing. Show us the international body or the international law that was codified during the time that we had chattel slaves. Show us that it was not legal during the time, right? And obviously the financial liability exposure that this type of law brings. The EU abstentions, the 50 are mainly from the EU, was largely about them not wanting a precedent to exist that they will be held to as far as liability. Like they didn't want to explicitly oppose because of the morality behind them explicitly opposing, right? So in the sense of them wanting to still look good morally, they abstained, but also abstaining because they didn't like the precedent of the financial liability exposure. The U.S. outright didn't care about the way it looked. They're like, nope, we didn't do anything wrong. Slavery wasn't illegal at the time. We had slaves and we don't owe a dime is basically what they're saying. We didn't do anything illegal. Now, the reason why it matters about them not abstaining and them voting no is that it's an affirmative rejection of every operative sentence and paragraph, including OP4, which is part of the resolution, which declares slavery as a fundamental rights violation. You're born free, you should die free kind of argument. That no vote is evidence that now we can utilize to say, hey, and we have in our arguments, this was something that could be known to be illegal at the time. And there's other indications that the US knew that, which are included in some of the arguments that we'll talk about. So they can't now say on the issue of reparations that it was not declared illegal at the time. They can't use the argument and then benefit off of the fact that they knew things were illegal or legal at the time. And so the abstention, just so you're clear, the 50 abstentions just are saying they don't want to commit, but they don't want to look bad morally and before, the world.
Right. So all that to say, the resolution, although passed, is not necessarily a blanket, legally binding resolution.
So when it comes to international law, it is legally binding. But here's the thing about the UN international law and the governance of it, right? When you think about the Declaration of Human Rights, that's a non-legally enforceable set of rights. You might as well call them good sounding principles or proverbs that people should live off of, because who is going to enforce the declaration? Countries have to agree by pact or treaty, some sort of act, and then hold themselves to that agreement when it comes to enforcement of violations of international law. So these 123 that said yes are more than willing to work off of treaties and agreements, covenants, charters, compacts, deals, and whatever not, that I didn't list there, to make sure that they hold themselves accountable. But that's even up into a point, right? And we've seen that over and over and over again throughout history, that if a country doesn't believe that it's doing anything wrong, and even when it knows it's doing something wrong, it won't stop. It'll continue to move forward with full force and not hold itself accountable. And what other country or body, including the international court, is going to come in and hold them accountable, especially if you don't have the social, political, financial, and physical force to do so. Right.
Exactly. Especially when you have a country, a state like the United States, a world power that voted no. That also has, and you can explain to the audience a little bit about the veto power. That I believe there are 7. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there are 7 countries in the UN that have this veto power, that can veto anything. And again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but they can veto anything that comes across. And if one of them says no, it doesn't necessarily go through. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, but that doesn't pertain to the General Assembly's votes, right? So their veto power is not going to even be relevant here. And as you can see, typically when you have a voting body, if you have the majority of the votes, and it passes by way of this General Assembly resolution being voted on, nobody will be able to veto that. And I want people to understand more about the UN and the General Assembly. So if you want to go over there, we can kind of show the function of the General Assembly. That way everyone understands what they can do and what they cannot do, right? I
Okay.
think it's helpful for people to also know how to navigate these sites so that you can find all this information that's going down, what's being stated, and how to, see who's making which argument. And you will either see the US's involvement or lack thereof, because like I was mentioning before, as there were calls for countries to send representation to CERD discussions about reparations, the US declined and could not at some point because they didn't send their data around racial discrimination to CERD. But then suddenly on the UN General Assembly floor, they have a lot to say and a no vote. Okay. Right.
Right.
So they had a period of time by which they could have addressed the board coming up with the repertory framework and said all of their, rejections of what was happening, but they didn't. They waited until a vote came forward on the floor and said no, and gave their reasoning in a formal statement by way of a hearing, and that becomes a legal argument.
Right.
They do not have any veto power when it comes to this particular General Assembly type of meeting and vote.
Let me ask you a quick question. So they have no veto power when it comes to this particular resolution. If things go forward, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, yeah, they can't veto. They can't veto this.
Right. If things go forward, as in some imposing of, reparations of some sort on nation states, would they then be able to exercise some sort of veto power? Does that ever change, or is that set in stone?
They won't be able to veto, and especially particular when we're talking about civil society submissions and this reparatory framework. There's nothing that they'll be able to veto. Okay, they can state their objection, but there's no veto power that they'll be able to exercise to amend, do away with, eliminate this law that currently exists in international law. So I want people to understand that that's clear.
Okay.
This is a pivotal point in history and on codified record that says the world established that in international law, chattel slavery was illegal. At the time it happened, it was the gravest crime known to Earth's history, on Earth's history. Okay. The U.S. can reject that argument, which it has, but it cannot veto that argument. So the resolution did pass. It's like a bill that becomes law. The resolution did pass and is now binding in the frame of international law.
Great. That's good to hear, because the United States, if they could take this a little bit further and just get the whole resolution tossed out and thrown away,
they can't.
I'm pretty sure they would.
They don't exercise power to be able to do that in this particular sense with regards to this type of law in this form, in the format of it being heard at the General Assembly. So they may exercise some veto power in other committees, in other places, but the way that their veto power, I guess the power that they had, they showed. So the power that they had at the UN, just know that it came by way of their formal rejection. That's the extent of power that they had. Okay. Right. Now, do they have power to exercise or not exercise, their understanding of this reparations being declared the gravest crime in history within their boundaries? Absolutely. And amongst their allies? Absolutely. right?
Okay. Okay.
So we can continue to claim by way of understanding this international law that, listen, slavery was the gravest crime, which doesn't necessarily negate anyone else's argument. We got to stop using that type of framing. Like when other people try to say, well, wait a minute, this happened to us. We always hear about this Holocaust and all of these things, that people want to bring out, because now this has been declared the gravest crime. And we don't have to measure our suffering in that sense.
Right.
But taking that to a court in the US, while the US has outright rejected all of the parts of the argument, including I need people to understand that part of the resolution argued for non-repetition, right? The
Right.
guarantee of non-repetition of chattel slavery, the US rejects that.
Wow. Well, let's move on. I want to ask you a question about the media focus on this, or the media's framing of this. Like I said earlier, this is kind of out of major news already, and I think it's just been a few weeks or so since the resolution was actually passed. It's already out of major news. We got so many more quote unquote important things going on. I often think of the timing of this is very significant, and we're going to talk about the timing of this in later shows, later lives to come. But I wanted to talk to you and ask you, do you see a difference in major media and Black media and the way they addressed this resolution?
Yeah, I mean, what I have seen and have been very disgusted by with regards to us as citizens of the US, otherwise captives of the US, is the lack of legal experts speaking about what this resolution does and does not, right? I have seen a lot of celebration, a lot of ceremonial types of memorial things like, oh, this is the greatest thing in history, while not even mentioning the fact that we have no representation, that the US rejected it, and we have no path for legal remedy, while ignoring the fact, even the biggest of all, is that the African Union is able to claim us under this framework, right? And so there's a lot of shaking hands, and it makes you wonder. When I see a picture of so-called civil rights leaders that represent Black voices in the US shaking hands with the Ghana president a week after this is signed, it makes you wonder, what's going on there. You know what I mean? Because are you telling them that they represent us, and they didn't survey you, brother, did they? Because they didn't survey me.
Right. Now, sorry to cut you off for a second there, but I think it's really important for you to explain to the audience this sort of handshaking that just went on recently. Because like I said, this was kind of pushed out of the news in the last few weeks. It just kind of lasted for what I see as a very short period of time. So the actual shaking of hands, the whole Al Sharpton thing that came about, I'm not even sure. I didn't see it. That was just brought to my attention earlier this morning.
Yeah,
And
I
I'm
want people to
sure,
look it up. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm sure a lot of people listening right now have no idea what you're talking about. So kind of explain what happened.
So within, less than 10 days after this resolution is passed on the General Assembly, UN, and I do understand that there is a UN headquarters building in New York, and that's where, you know, Al Sharpton is, obviously. But within less than 10 days, you have him in his office taking pictures, shaking hands with the Ghana official, representing the AU and its framework and its, you know, argument for there he is right there. Okay, just so y'all know. And what it does is try to memorialize this as a celebratory moment. But then when you see what's lacking from the reparatory framework and who's able to make a claim, then you wonder why they're so excited and shaking hands. Okay. Especially when we know that the African Union has not even addressed their own apology, financial responsibility, and reform towards the sale of the same chattel slaves that they're declaring reparations for, because they had kingdoms that sold slaves. So how are they going to be held responsible for that harm committed, right? How can the perpetrators then ask for justice for the victims, right? The perpetrators of a crime then seek justice for the victims, and we think that the outcome is get catered towards us, and then can control, dominate the conversation, the framework, the asks. How do they even know that the descendants of U.S. chattel slavery see their demands as just? Okay, and we're gonna get into that, you know, when we look at the fact that in Joel it says, "Away you have carried away my gold, silver, and you know, Judah and Jerusalem." You don't. We're not just talking about fiat currency here. Okay, fiat currency, which is paper money that relies on the government's declaration that it's money and it equates to a certain amount, and the people's belief in it. What is it backed by, right? What artifacts are they speaking of? Okay, because we know that, you know, if we look at from Abraham all the way down to Isaac, artifacts are a minimalization of what our ancestors have had. And so, you know, I am very aware of the arguments that they're framing in the very superficial nature of asks and the money grab. But we're not just pointing to fiat currency as a remedy, right? We're not just pointing to fiat currency as a legal reparatory framework, especially when in the U.S., slavery still exists by way of the 13th Amendment loophole that says that you can still imprison people if you find guilty of a crime. And we know the disparate impact if we look at the data, which they didn't turn into the UN, by the way, the US didn't on purpose.
Right.
That shows the disparity. How many Black men have been incarcerated strictly for their labor? I mean, Alabama has underway right now, and the UN has went to go visit and speak on this, that what they're doing is denying people, is particularly mainly Black men, parole, because they want them in a work release program where they work for private industries. Okay, so they'll trust them enough to drive them to a Wendy's to work for a day, or a furniture store, but they don't trust them to be free. No, it's a money grab. It's still it's neo-slavery, but by another name. And if we can follow that path from so-called abolishment of slavery to convict leasing to mass incarceration, and you'll see the youth that it has been designed to harm and exploit for labor, and you will see the population that are the group of people very distinct. It's us. And so these claims haven't even been brought up, and again, that's missing from media's discussion, right? One of the things that is existing in media's discussion is how the Caribbean has made demands and what their involvement has been. So I want people to pay attention to that, because CARICOM is partners with the AU and they have their position on record, right? But when it comes to so-called leaders, and I mean, Ben Crump's a lawyer. Why couldn't he break this down, right?
Right.
So I'm gonna stop there because I'll go on a whole tangent about
Right,
the
right.
PLA.
I was just gonna say we can go into a whole nother topic when we start talking about mass incarcerations and the the imposition of the imposing of the Atlantic slave trade as it reflects on Black men living in the United States. Before we go into what you've done and the document that you've submitted to the UN, which is pretty much why we're here, you touched very, very just a little bit on the Caribbean nations and their part in this resolution. So before we go over to what you've done in your document, I do want you to talk a little bit more about the Caribbean nations and their part in the structure of this resolution.
So what I mean by that is CARICOM, right? And I'm not sure if that can be brought up as we speak. CARICOM meets with the AU for the reparatory framework. So
and just so everybody knows what CARICOM is, because I didn't know until I read your document and kind of dived into this. So
CARICOM is and I'm gonna say the name precisely because I have a memory, but let me just go ahead and say it exactly. I don't want. Okay, so there it is right there. So let me see. The commission is basically the Caribbean community, right? So if you look at CARICOM, it's representation the Caribbean community. You'll see that right on their own thing. Now they have these member states within CARICOM. You see Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada. I'm sorry, my glasses are working, but they sometimes don't. Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, Montserrat, Saint Lucia, Saint Kitts, and obviously Trinidad. So these are islands outside of US. They're not representing, again, US descendants of chattel slavery. And we know that our particular suffering under chattel slavery is unlike anyone else's.
Absolutely.
So that's what CARICOM is. CARICOM has its own reparatory framework, right? Based on, its members. So when they speak for themselves. The African Union, by way of calling the diaspora out, leaves way to speak for everyone.
Right.
With the framing of the diaspora. That's legal framing. I need people to understand that. You know how when you're looking at a legal document, or if you're looking at a law or a bill, it's going to give legal definitions. That means that's the legal framing. That's what it indicates. That's who they're talking about, right? So know that when the African Union represents the diaspora, they're talking about me and you, brother. Even though we didn't agree, and they're talking about the viewers, right? Even though we didn't agree to their representation.
Exactly. And those are some really strong points. And that is the perfect segue into discussing what you've done. So you submitted a document to the UN. I guess we can call it a rebuttal. Would that be fair?
Yeah, we can call it a challenge. Definitely a legal one.
Absolutely. So what I want you to do right now is just explain the document. Just sort of a high level view of the document, why you submitted it, and what it addresses, and the points that it addresses immediately, the major points.
So immediately, I wanted to address that the descendants of U.S. chattel slavery are distinct, a separate group, right? That can be defined under international law as a distinct and recognizable, distinguished group of people, right? That have a particular claim based on the specific legal institution of U.S. chattel slavery, so that we can have legal precision in designating ourselves right off the bat. Okay. That, specific codified rules such as partis sequitur ventrum and Virginia statutes, like that one that came from that mechanism that made slavery heritable through the mother, the condition of the mother, that which follows the belly. Partis sequitur ventrum, translate from Latin to English, that which follows the belly. Okay. Now, I also talked about where the U.S. erred in its, outright rejection and statement that made it a legal defense for them about international law not existing. This letter in particular that you're looking at is based off of the special rapporteur who visited the U.S. and had some recommendations of her own. And so I remind that person of those recommendations and how the U.S. has not so far abided by those or wanted to even appreciate the value of those recommendations. I also specifically notify them that the African Union does not speak for U.S. descendants of chattel slavery, and that we have to be a legally distinct group. Mm-hmm. That we were not a part of any discussion, that we weren't able to present our arguments. We weren't able to present our evidence at the hearing, and the U.S. didn't represent us either in its outright rejection. And so what we're saying is we're just a group that exists that hasn't been heard yet, as of yet. There is no legal pathway in the U.S. for us to be heard, right? And therefore, if that legal pathway for us to be heard through the U.S. is not respected, then it's something that the UN definitely needs to respect.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you real quick. So the U.S.'s vote of no, right? And we discussed this a little bit before about how non-legally binding that vote of no is. What does your document seek to accomplish by putting forward the idea again that the U.S. was one of the countries that voted no, and descendants of chattel slavery living in America are not represented? What are we looking to accomplish with your, I'll call it a rebuttal?
So there's a common saying that, often is quoted, that if we allow people to oppress us and say nothing, they'll think that we enjoyed it, right? So first of all, we're making our declaration and our stance right here. We're drawing our line in the sand, and we're saying we are a legally distinguished group, separate from the broader African diaspora or recent African immigrants to the U.S., okay? And we have a very specific legal argument with evidence of the atrocities that have existed from the point of chattel enslavement until today, right? That no one else can make except for us. And no one else can claim, without our ability to distinguish ourselves. So first, that legal distinction needs to be made.
Right.
Okay. And I know, there's going to be people that find that harsh, like, well, why don't we want to go along with the Pan-Africanists are happy today, right? Like, we can just go along with the African Union and build up Africa. That ain't what we doing. Just so I can say it frankly, no,
Right.
we're not building any more mercantile cities for Pharaoh. Period. Stop. Right there in history. Okay. We have this legal distinction to let it be known to the international community that we know who we are and we are legally distinct from anyone else making an argument over reparations here, and we have to be heard. And since we weren't, then any frameworks that come from this UN resolution and law are going to be biased and botched, because we haven't had our legal distinction, we haven't had our evidence or our voices heard. And so this is where we interject into the record, because they're not going to just exploit and oppress us without us making our claim or statement. And so that's essentially what I have done with 3 separate UN submissions. Okay.
Right. Okay.
And I've given examples of how U.S. codified its slavery and then continued to exploit us, whether it be through the 13th Amendment or things like party sequitur ventrum that persist through family courts, child welfare services, and a rule that Congress instituted called CAPTA, the Child Abuse and Prevention and Treatment Act, today, and how those have disproportionately kept our families ripped apart. So there are unique arguments that I also put into the submissions.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more about those unique arguments? Going through your document, there are more domestic arguments, if I can phrase it that way, that definitely shine in your document, that are specific to descendants of chattel slavery living in America. Can you talk a little bit more about those domestic arguments and domestic remedies that you're seeking?
Okay, yes. If you can stop on the document, like right there, I want to read, off of the document itself. But what I want to make clear is that we are not asking to be separated from our people. Like me and you, we have the same argument. What we're insisting on is that our specific legal claim not be diluted by being folded into a category that was of people that was never subjected to U.S. chattel slavery. Okay, so we got to be very clear about that. Now, in the letter to the special rapporteur, as you can see, I start out with party sequitur ventrum, and I do that because that was the original way to maintain slavery and the first reproductive claim that could be made over Black bodies, in a way by which slave masters could then, without any accountability, rape Black bodies and produce more children. And, I got to say this at this point because it's interesting how the U.S. government enforces child support, but white slave masters have never paid a dime for the children that they forced Black bodies to reproduce. Okay. Now, while their children were able to inherit land through land act, rights and all of these other generational things that equated to wealth, the white men never paid their child support bill. Okay. I just want to say that, but they'll enforce it. They'll enforce it though. So here we have first party sequitur ventrum and the continuing destruction of the descendants of U.S. Chattel slavery family. So in Virginia in 1662, in the statute, codified in statute, and codified just means that it's compiled, written, and organized in a way that we see the Bill of Rights, that we see the Code of Federal Regulations, that in your state you would have the public health and safety codes or education codes. These are all compiled, organized, and maintained by some government entity. Okay. So, by way of statute, named twice in the resolution itself, as the recognition of which the U.S. voted against, made chattel slavery hereditary, which means it wouldn't matter how we felt about it. They never intended to stop it. Chattel slavery became hereditary based on the condition of the mother, who was also a slave. Okay. And as you see right there, through the maternal body, which then also makes us have to identify with the matrilineal lineage for, anything that we want to verify, right? And so it eliminated paternal legal obligation for children fathered by white men on enslaved women and legally incentivized rape. So, they talk about the EP Steen files. I don't want the line to get shut down. But America's been EP Steen Island from its inception, from its foundation, right? From the very beginning. And it started with the brutal rape of Black women's bodies to procreate more slaves. And if you look at the manifests, the majority of those were children. Okay, full stop. Okay, so we know who these people are, and by making the resulting child their property. Okay, no U.S. statute has ever abolished the doctrine by name. So I want everyone to know that while the U.S. rejected the non-repetition clause and every other part or guarantee part of the resolution that was signed into international law, they have also never by name eradicated or abolished or done away with partis sequitur ventrum. Now, some legal scholars will, surmise or conjecture that it's folded under the abolishment of slavery. But if you don't abolish or eradicate something by name, then you can't assume that it has been eradicated or abolished. And when you start to see different things function institutionally or systemically the same way, just by a different name, then those things were not eradicated and abolished. It just changed names, which we know these people as they like to do. So that's one of the first things that I point out. And because the resolution A30L.48 talks about partis sequitur ventrum and why the African Union brought it up, obviously because they needed the argument to make the claim, right? Because it has to do particularly with the system of U.S. chattel slavery. And their codified rule of that which follows the body. So I brought that up. And then I talk about, again, no U.S. statute has ever abolished by by name this doctrine. Its inherited status logic continues to operate through the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974, otherwise known as CAPTA, which is congressionally funded, under which over 50% of Black children will experience a child welfare investigation. Now, the audience can think of it as this. How many Black children or families do you know, even including your own, that haven't been visited by Child Welfare Service, CPS, DCS, ACS? I don't care what they call themselves, right? Whether it was by way of a doctor call, a school call, whatever, a neighbor call, right? Who haven't had an interaction at all with the Child Welfare Services, okay? So I point that out in a legal way, all right? And we'll experience a child welfare investigation. Over 50% of Black children will experience a child welfare investigation before their 18th birthday. And I need to let that sit with people. Some of those meaning that they got taken from their home. Some of those meaning that they were then placed on what I call the neo slave auction block to be placed elsewhere and someone to be paid to care for them instead of them being with their kin, right? Even though there's rules in CAPTA that say that families have priority, we know that governments overlook the rules that they don't like.
Right.
And they can't, financially gain from.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So all by their 18th birthday, nearly double the rate of white children. And Black children are 4 times less likely to be reunified, though there's a clause in CAPTA that says reunification is priority. The Black children are less likely to be reunified with their families than white children once they have been removed. And a lot of that removal is in a way that otherwise would violate the U.S. Constitution, but because they frame it as in the child's best interest, they get away with these constitutional violations through CAPTA all the time, every day of the week. This happens.
Mm.
Okay, so I told this special rapporteur that her 2023 country visit, meaning she came to the United States, documented these racial disparities in the child welfare system, which she did. And there is documentation, if you want to go look that up, the UN visit to the U.S. and the documented harms of the child welfare services towards Black children. You can go look that up. There's a ton of research.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. voted essentially with their no against international recognition of the very legal doctrine that created this harm.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the kind of points that I bring up. Okay.
Right.
Second, and this is very important, and I'm going to stop reading after the second one because then we can go on about this. But the medical torture and pseudoscientific architecture of slavery. So I don't know if you guys have ever looked up J. Marion Sims or Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright, who basically said that you were dealing with some mental condition if you ran away, right? And
it was called drapetomania.
Drapetomania, right? Like, you are mentally ill if you try to reject your status as a slave and captive, who, or try to, if you were sad about being beaten. And this transferred into the medical and psychiatric community in ways that continue to harm people today. Okay? There are people that are being held, and I want you to look at the racial disparity in this, for evaluations in juvenile halls and jails and prisons and in an indefinite manner. Right now, I've had to help several families with that. One being a juvenile who was held without any criminal charges in the state of Indiana, a young Black juvenile, for an entire year, awaiting a psychiatric evaluation. I want y'all to think about that. Okay. And with that psychiatric evaluation, no crime, because you can't even go to court to be charged with a crime until you are deemed medically or mentally competent to go to court. So that holding can be indefinite. And I basically got that young brother released immediately as a juvenile back to his family and community, because nobody was there to challenge them, right? So I want you to think about, as I read this paragraph, and I'm talking to the audience about this medical torture, this psychiatric, pseudoscientific frameworks that were, codified even under medical journals by the United States, has continued to transfer and equal harm today. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so second, medical torture and pseudoscientific architecture of slavery between 1845 and 1849. J. Marion Sims, later president of the American Medical Association, developed foundational gynecological surgical techniques through repeated experimentation on enslaved Black women and girls without anesthesia. We've seen in news recently where women have died saying they were in pain, delivering children in the waiting room, dying, or whatever else happened. They kept the other woman's alive at the attestation of her family, who said, we don't want her body kept alive. She didn't want to be kept alive, in order to deliver the baby. That was a medical experiment in your face, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so anarcho, and we know Wilcox is that last name, aged 17, underwent at least 30 procedures. The pseudoscientific framework that made this possible was created by Samuel A. Cartwright, who in 1851 classified the desire for freedom as mental illness and prescribed whipping and amputation as treatment. Okay. So you didn't get to the medical pseudoscientific stuff without the psychiatric or psychological pseudoscientific literature and codification and subsequent acceptance by the U.S. And when has the U.S. as a formal entity said that any of this is wrong? Now, I've seen where the American Medical Association have said, unfortunately, these are things of our past, but we, want to be better. But did you overhaul the framework? That's a question people should ask. And I've seen where the American Psychological Society has then said, that we recognize that this was wrong. It's pseudoscientific. We don't operate that way anymore. But did you overhaul every single idea, theory, or diagnosis framework that stemmed from Sims and Cartwright? I doubt it. Okay, because we can definitely pattern those together. So that was part of what I also made an argument about. This framework was not repudiated by the U.S. U.S. law, and has been documented to continue influencing racial health disparities, including maternal health and outcomes. And, her visit documented that inequitable health care and health outcomes for Black Americans. So I remind the special rapporteur of this as well. The pseudoscientific architecture that produced those disparities has never been legally addressed. Okay. Sure. Then I go on to talk about the 13th Amendment, brother. I don't know if you want me to read that third argument, but if not, we can just go down, obviously reminding them again that Black men are incarcerated at 5.6 times the rate of white men. And this is documented in U.S. history, and that the Special Rapporteur of the UN, her visit, documented this racial disparity in criminal justice as well. So we're looking at every single domain that exists, whether that be family, health care, incarceration. We're looking at every domain saying, hey, you guys have already mentioned this, but it's not represented by the African Union, nor can any other group or body that was at the UN hearing represent this. The US could have, but didn't. I'll tell you that, because they're not going to hold themselves accountable. They don't even see anything wrong with all of this, right? And then fourth, the inadequate setting up by design and inadequate funding of the Freedmen's Bureau, right? Government acknowledgement without adequate remedy. So I have read through invoices and receipts of years of Freedmen's Bureau conversations between agents on the ground and the U.S. government. Hey, we need supplies over here. We're not able to, do our job or what the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to do because we don't have the resources, and the U.S. government knew that. They didn't have the resources to do what they claimed they were going to do. So it was just something that they established or erected that was ineffective. And there was no massive undertaking by way of the Freedmen's Bureau at the abolishment of slavery to reunite children with their families. So I want you guys to think about that. Because we know that children were held as domestic servants. So, separate from people that they, were familiar with or maybe had been with. And whatever that may be, there was no major even world undertaking to reunite families with each other. Like the way that we are looking things up today through things like 23andMe or GEDmatch or whatever, the Freedmen's Bureau didn't care about that. You know, how do you reunite and reconnect families? Okay, so you know, this government acknowledgement without adequate remedy is one of the staple behaviors of the U.S. as well. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands documented the names of nearly 1.8 million formerly enslaved men, women, and children, but the Bureau was closed after 7 years. It promised 40 acres. And we're not even going to start on. I'm laughing, but it ain't funny, y'all. Okay.
Yeah,
Because
right.
how many times have we continued to share this intergenerational exchange of the 40 acres and the mule, right? It promised 40 acres, but then when they were revoked, and there was, if you can go up a little bit so that I can read what I was already basically, no, I'm sorry, down, please. What I was already reading off of the document. So I'm bringing these arguments straight to the UN. Okay, these are things that we have the specific claim to, which make us legally distinct. Okay, so that promise was revoked. The Freedmen's Bureau's job duty was revoked, and there was no systemic family repair program ever established. Though there was a law to divide and disrupt and disconnect, you know, mother from children and fathers from, you know, what would be their wives, and Black families were disrupted and continue to be so under guise of other laws. There was never an undertaking to reunite families. If you were let go, you're just let go, right? And some people weren't let go for real, you know, which is a whole nother topic. But what the Freedmen's Bureau does do is help us with that historic record.
Right. Okay. That makes total sense. Thank you. That I think that was great for you to kind of go through some of the claims that, the claims that you made to the UN about the historical oppression that has happened to our people and continue to happen to our people. One of the things I want to ask, and we addressed this maybe just a little bit earlier. We do know that the African Union and the Caribbean nations, they sort of formulated this resolution, right? We have living in the United States, and I'm definitely one of them. First generation, second generation, third generation Black people who are not descendants of chattel slavery living in America. And I'll just say this: my parents are both Jamaican. Right? Different type of chattel slavery over in Jamaica, right? But your document makes a very clear distinction of American chattel slavery as opposed to any other chattel slavery in the Americas, period, that took place. Yours
and
is
across the world.
Right. Yours is focused distinctly on the United States. And let me just ask this because it's in my mind. Do you think that separation separates us even further? And when I say us, I mean descendants of Caribbean people living in the United States who have a lot of these things that you mentioned, this oppression, this historical oppression that continues, have gone through this in the United States from birth, being born in the United States till current, till present. Do you think this causes a clear line of separation? And going forward, how does that help us?
It has to, because our ancestors were all bound by different codified rules. Like, see, here's the thing. You can't make a constitutional republic or democracy, whatever you want to call the US, corporation, an entity, or whatever that was built off of partis sequitur ventrum and chattel slavery codified, and then you know, not create a remedy for that, continue to have wealth in a system built off of these laws that the US created that were unique from what was happening in the Caribbean or Jamaica, that were unique from what was happening even in Europe, and in you know, their continued slavery, having fortresses in Spain or Portugal or whatever. They had their own set of established norms, rules, principles, things that were codified, right? Even unique in Mexico, right? Even unique in different parts of the Americas, like you said, South and Central America, even, you know, different than what happened in Canada. So we have to make the distinction based off of what was legally codified, based off the duration of time that was, you know, suffered, and based off of the continued harm by renaming of laws into or folding them into other structures and institutions that we see affecting our condition and status today, based off the fact that our families were torn apart. So we may even see a different practice in Brazil, right? Like if you look up the history of, you know, what happened under slavery in Brazil, you might see a different time frame. Even the duration may be different. So these distinctions do matter. And when we look at the U.S. Chattel slavery system, we see no other like it. And so our claim has to be based off of what existed, what happened, the duration, the people that were harmed, their descendants, which is us. And only we can make that claim. Right? We didn't hire anyone else or ask anyone else to represent us in this. And so I don't say that in hypocrisy. Yes, I filed the documents, but all of you guys have the ability to state your claim. Right? I want people to understand that we're a legally distinct and separate group of people, and we're not diminishing anyone else's argument. What we're saying is we have our own that needs to be heard and hasn't as of yet. In an international forum, or even in the sense of a real national forum here in the United States of America, been heard in a way that directly connects to the legal violation, the codified rule, and the legal distinction and remedy at all. There's no pathways to do that currently that exist. However, them voting on this reparations resolution at the General Assembly created a pathway for us to do it, essentially. And I don't know if they thought about that, but that's fine with us. We're willing to now utilize that pathway to make our argument. But prior to that, you know, we're just kind of having these conversations through social media, you know, in the community with each other, other places, whatever. But now we have on the record this claim as legally distinct.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. And right before we go into you know, what I'm calling the last section, kind of the call to action. I did want to ask you, we ran over some of the arguments made, the historical atrocities that even continue up until this day. But the actual remedies in your document, can you go over really quickly some of the remedies that you're looking for? What do you actually want?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I was going to say stop right here because it'll show part of that remedy. If you go back up to the title of here, yeah, we could definitely go over that. Yes.
Okay.
So as you can see, this particular submission is the one to the special repertoire. You'll see other submissions, and we can go over to one of those documents after this. But the specific request is based on the function and the duty of either that committee or that role at the UN. So with regards to what I requested that the special rapporteur do is to issue formal communication to the United States government requesting a written explanation of the following, right? Because that's what her or his role is capable of doing. I didn't ask them to do what their role or function, which was anything outside of the scope of what they can do. Okay, so I asked this particular role and function to ask the questions to the U.S. How is the vote against operative paragraph 4 under the resolution declaring chattel slavery a just Coggins violation consistent with the accountability framework established in another resolution that was voted on already? How is the vote against the parte sequitur ventrum preambular clause? Because remember, I said parte sequitur ventrum was brought up in the resolution itself. Consistent with your visits, documentation of racial disparities in the child welfare outcomes. How is the vote against the non-statutory limitations preambular clause consistent with your visits call for enhanced accountability mechanisms? And what specific domestic measures that the U.S. has taken since November 2023 to implement any other recommendations in a whole nother resolution pertaining to harms done to Black Americans? Okay. Then we want number 2, issue a statement. So there's some questions that need to be answered because there's some contradictions. And the legal contradictions are very telling, right? Then we go on to, issue within this role of what this person's capable of doing, a statement characterizing the U.S. vote against the resolution, read against the recommendations that the special rapporteur wrote and they voted on, as a documented regression from the accountability framework that the U.S. apparently partook in back in another General Assembly, year during country visits and when they were in agreements and treaties and pacts. Because remember, we talked about every single country having the ability to partake in the UN dealings based on treaties, pacts, agreements, commissions, committees, and votes, right? What their role is going to be. But let us never forget that the US is responsible for creating the United Nations. Let us never forget that. Okay. So, we want to know about the documented regression. And we're calling it out. This is a documented regression from a prior agreement. Okay. And part of that was during her or his visit, because you don't know who's going to be in the role in the next 2 years. So we just want to say whoever it is right now, and then what that role entails in the future, so you'll know. 3, include in a follow-up country or thematic report on the United States that the descendants of U.S. chattel slavery have a specific claim as distinct in our claim is a distinct domestic matter not addressed by the African Union Reparatory framework. Again, repeating what is very important. They have their own claims. We have ours. Their claims don't represent our claims. We need to be heard on that. Okay. That obviously parte sequitur ventrum, which the special rapporteur has already made recommendations about CAPTA, going back over that legal chain as a continued and a continuous government administered destruction of descendants of U.S. chattel slavery, family and integrity, and the integrity of our families and our ability to protect our families from this government intrusion, right? That the Cartwright pseudoscientific framework and Sims medical experimentation as documented institutional ratio embedded in U.S. medical history and practice with continuing racial health disparities consequentially as that framework was established on the backs of slaves that wanted to be free and now are deemed medically or mentally ill somehow, right? The 13th Amendment exception clause as a structural racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, and the AU representation gap as a risk that the descendants of U.S. Chattel slavery, with specific legal interests, will be displaced in a broader repertory framework. So if we continue to just sit back, watch the news, wait for them, Al Sharpton and the Ghanaian president to shake hands, wait for Ben Crump to say, yeah, we like this, framing, and the AU to keep smiling and saying, yeah, this is the gravest thing, and say nothing, then we gonna get what we always got.
Okay.
Most of that being hoodwinked, bamboozled, and run amok. Okay. And so we have to be able to codify our experiences, why, we should have this legal distinction, the unique claim of things that happen particularly to us and our ancestors, and why that needs to be included, not ignored, in any reparatory international framework that exists. That's the beginning. Okay. That's where we're at with these submissions.
All right. So let me ask you this really quick. So a lot of the remedies that we have, like I'm looking at number 2 right now, it's about the United States issuing a public statement, right? Are we looking for these remedies to then, for example, have the United States issue a public statement so that we can then take that statement and formulate another legal, have another legal option in which we can use that public statement to reinforce, another case or another suit or a legal suit against the United States for more than just this African Union, Caribbean nations, sort of resolution thing, that we can use their public statement to then move forward with our cause?
Well, and essentially we are, because that's what these submissions refer to, is their very public statement, meaning the resolution that was already voted on has now become international law, as the pivoting point by which we need to be able to assert ourselves, because we don't really have any courts within the United States that acknowledge our remedy or our sought remedy of reparations. Because if you're the U.S. and you're saying we didn't do anything wrong, why would any of the courts in the U.S. hear our argument of reparations? Why would the governing body, meaning 3 branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial branch, care about anything that we're saying? And essentially, we have to know that us making our assertion here and not allowing other people to hijack or co-opt our identities any further, and our suffering, and our just overall discussions of this, doesn't mean that they'll care. Our assertions, our submissions, etc. But what it does do is let them know that we're not going to continue to be exploited in this way. And under laws and rules that you guys abide by any other time, you allow civil society submissions and groups to assert themselves, present evidence, and be heard. And so if you don't, want to hear us, then that'll be very telling as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think what it does is create an entry point, right? More than a legally enforceable tool. Maybe in the future, it will offer a legally enforceable tool. But again, I mean, as with everything that happens at the UN, what can be legally enforced against the US? Right. I mean, we saw even taking things to the international court with regards to the conflict that existed on the Strip. I'm not going to say names because I don't want the live shut down, right? What could be legally enforced? We see what's happening in the Straits. I'm not gonna say the name again, right?
Right.
Who's sending their efforts to, except for the country that is suffering, they're defending themselves. Who else is condemning and enforcing anything against the US? So what we're essentially saying is that, hey, here we are right here. And as for everybody else, they have their own body to represent them, but we representing our arguments, our suffering, and our unique stance, legally distinct from all others, never remedied, and ongoing systemically. And we need that distinction to happen now in international law. And, hopefully, with regards to enforceable mechanisms, we have to look at as other fundamental rights that are violated, even constitutional rights that have been violated here in the US, where, we still experience constitutional violations with no enforcement mechanisms. What do we do? Right? And that's a discussion that I personally can't dictate for all descendants of US chattel slavery. I can tell you the legal pathways, but based on the harm that you and your family experience should be the remedy. Do we have access to a remedy right now? No, I'm going to be honest with you. Nobody's, who's going to enforce that remedy? If there were even a remedy, who enforced the 40 acres and a mule?
Right.
So I'm not going to get up here and do what some of the boule do and give you empty promises. This is a fight. One that we can choose to partake in. But as I was watching all of this unfold and seeing that our voices were never heard, we weren't able to submit evidence, there was no distinction made, I knew that I had to submit something.
Right. Absolutely. That makes sense. Thanks for that. And I hope everybody's clear on that. One thing, and the reason why I asked that question is, one of the things that we've seen kind of happen throughout history is history in this country is certainly on and after the civil rights movement. Lots of claims, where the sister is not the first one to submit a document to the United Nations. The sister is not the first one to kind of try to buck up against the quote unquote boule and not have people speak for us who are not necessarily our representatives, because we've seen nothing come of that. So I wanted to establish and let everybody know that this is more of a jump off point than anything else. The responses that we get back, kind of putting the UN, particularly the United States, holding them to the fire and making them respond and taking those responses and using those responses as a legal framework to move forward. Did I frame that correctly, Christina?
Yes, absolutely. And there may be Afro Latinos that are saying, look, Mexico went and had a voice in the CERD, but they're not doing what they say they gonna do. Hey, this serves as a framework. Okay. There may be people that don't feel represented by CARICOM, but that are a part of their member states. This serves as a framework, right? Literally place the laws, rules that pertain to you and your experiences. Send the submissions however you want. I'm not telling anyone not to represent their cause. But what I'm saying is that we have to start representing ours better. We have to stop relying on, I'll call it the grass tops, because they ain't the grassroots, for our representation, because they're not representing you and they're shaking hands and signing deals to further exploit our suffering, to further expand our condition. If you see a so-called civil rights organization saying that, yeah, we've been fighting for the Black cause for freedom for over 40 years and we in worse condition and our children don't have any upward mobility pathways. Have they really? We have to begin to challenge those things. And the first step is making your claim. How can you tell someone they did something to you if you didn't submit a legal claim in a codified system? This is not an orally tradition system.
Right.
So we have to understand that designation, that the United States of America is a codified entity, which means that everything goes by the rule of law. Even when if they don't want to follow the rule of law, like they don't have to, but you better believe you got to. Okay. Right. So with that being said, then you have to submit your legal claim against what is being said, or it doesn't exist. You can argue with people on the phone and YouTube and TikTok all day.
Right.
Okay. That's not evidence.
Right, absolutely. And that is the absolute perfect segue into kind of our next and last session here. The communities.
I hope I didn't go off the tube.
Oh, no, you did not. This is the perfect segue, because I'm going to ask my big bro, Brother Cleo, to kind of put that on the screen. And we're going to talk about this community submission. And we're going to give people listening the opportunity to submit this. If you like, if what the sister said here today, sort of lit a fire underneath you, makes you want to do something about this, spark these legal claims so that the descendants of chattel slavery living in America can move forward. That we can move forward, which I want to point out we will be speaking about in a later, another live, not this one, but we'll be speaking about in another live, the spiritual, prophetic, and scriptural implications of these types of things and what's going on in the world right now in these end times, and why this is important, not just to the descendants of chattel slavery, but to all of true Israelites. So sis,
I look forward to that discussion too, because I know that there are people watching. Shout out to my dad, who's actually texting me while he's watching. It wants to talk about the spiritual, prophetic, and revelations based, even revelation based historical moment, right? So hopefully everyone will definitely tune into that. But what you see right here is the submission template. Okay. And you have the ability to utilize it or create your own. I offer the emails. You can even look them up. But if you want to base a submission off of, what I wrote, then you are understanding that the international human rights bodies, excuse me, I had to take a drink, and so I was trying to make sure I'm drinking some aloe drink here. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The international human rights bodies respond to patterns of documented harm. Okay, so while I am the policy and legislation expert on this matter, I am also a descendant of U.S. chattel slavery, declaring that there has been a harm to me and my family, and giving some experiences and testimony. One person's story is a testimony. Thousands of stories is evidence. Now, the list of issues processed for the ICCPR periodic review is directly influenced by civil society submissions. So some of these bodies, you can directly influence what they're going to do by your submissions, by multiple submissions, right? So I give you an example. I am writing, in support of the civil society submission filed by Christina, because I was the first one to file on this issue, 8 days after the UN resolution that became law, saying that slavery was the gravest crime committed in the history of on the earth. And chattel slavery and reparations needed to exist. I filed 8 days after that, declaring us as legally distinct and needing to be able to provide our own evidence to represent ourselves. Okay, so you'll see that. And then you can give your story, your grandmother's story. I know people that are still fighting over stolen homes, property, land rights that were stolen from them. You know, you could talk about redlining. How has that affected you? You could talk about the lack of educational attainment, discrimination in schools, whatever has affected you and your family, or you know, your grandparents and great grandparents, stories that may have been passed down, or you could just state facts such as data. Whatever you choose to do, this is your time to enter into the record your testimony. So that's what this submission does. And like I said, some of these bodies at the UN operate by civil society submissions. That they create their whole agenda and set of priorities around civil society submissions.
Okay. All right. So two questions I have. The first question is, like I described a little bit earlier, descendants of United States chattel slavery. If I'm not a descendant of United States chattel slavery, should I fill out and submit this form?
If you're in you know, a descendant of what happened in the Caribbean, right, then you would change it to frame what CARICOM is doing. Okay, so whatever, you don't have to be a descendant of U.S. chattel slavery to be. You could be a descendant of some other form of slavery and still create a civil society submission. This particular submission is one that is in support of my original submission on April 2nd, and it's gonna be particularly to the descendants of U.S. chattel slavery. I can't tell you what other countries and their members or victims are doing, so I can speak particularly to what's happening here, U.S. side.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks for that, Christina.
So
The
yeah, you do
second,
need to be a descendant of U.S. chattel slavery to fill out this template that I have.
right.
Overall, I'm sorry that I didn't want to confuse that. If you're talking about civil society submissions to the UN, no, you don't have to necessarily be that. People can go over there and check out what I'm saying, look up the UN civil society submissions, and you'll find out that you can submit individual reports if you believe that it's something that, you know, you want to be heard about. I mean, there's people that do it about torture and things like that. If they've been tortured, harmed by law enforcement, you know, they submit.
Right. So descendant of a non-descendant of U.S. chattel slavery can use your template, but would not would kind of change that template, the wording of it around. Is that basically what you're saying?
Right, wherever their lineage is based from, right? And the harm that was basically, you know, the exploitation and the abuse that resulted in harm to them and their families, right?
Right.
That's what they would have to prove.
Okay. Okay.
And,
That makes sense. And my second question is, people filling out and submitting this form, will it put them on any, and I'll just phrase it this way, sort of blacklist? Is that possible? Is there any specific, or can there be any specific danger to someone putting their name, address, other identifiable information on a form like this and sending it to the UN?
I mean, the UN is supposed to protect personally identifiable information. They're not supposed to publicly post it. They can offer the testimony. I've been blacklisted so long, brother, that I don't even look. It doesn't affect me, but I tell each and every person to count the cost. Like, I mean, what governments are not supposed to do, we find out they do. So, I mean, I can't guarantee a protection either way. I can guarantee that you're putting the truth and your testimony out there, but because I operate under this realm of blacklisting, I don't care. right? I'm
Right.
going to make sure that the truth is declared and things are not convoluted or folded under another person's cause every single time.
Right. Right.
So, you do have to count the cost, such as I have done that years ago. Like when I start telling governments that they're corrupt and that they're acting in a way that is a contravention of their own laws, I already know that that's going to create a problem.
Right.
Right. But this isn't the same thing. It's not so much of that direct threat of you saying, like, look, what she submitted is true. We're legally distinct. We have our own suffering that happened, and there's no current body that sits at the UN that is representing us. So here is my testimony, and I represent myself. That's essentially what you're doing by that submission.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And I did want to state that just to let everybody know. There are times when we can ask you to do something. We can make this a call to action, which is what we're doing right now. Asking people to kind of go in and fill out this form. And I believe brother Big Bro Cleo, I believe you're going to put the link to the template and the place to submit it either on the screen or in the chat so that people can access it when they need to. But like I was saying, I do think it's important to let people know what could come of this, the possibilities. Although it is a call to action, it is also optional. We don't want anyone doing anything that they don't want to do. I don't want anyone saying, "Hey, brother Najee told me to do this. Now my whole family's under fire." What, brother Najee? What you gonna do for me? We don't want that.
No, this is for the brave, bold, and courageous. I'm going to say that, right?
Absolutely.
Because there are some times where I'm addressing governments and it's just me on behalf of just us. Okay. Should it be that way? No, but then I understand that there is a real fear that exists that, a lot of the community may have that doesn't exist with me because I've done this. And so this is for the bold, brave, and courageous. And I'm going to be honest about that because I cannot guarantee any protection. And I'm not guaranteed protection. I go out and do it knowing that Shirahaya, who is the great I am, is going to cover me. And I'm not going to allow myself to be oppressed and exploited and then one day say, well, they enjoyed it. Because they didn't say anything. So that's the way that every person has to count the cost and make a decision on their own. I won't say that there is gonna be harm, but I'm not the UN, right? I'm a person addressing the UN. I've submitted so many documents at this point, and like I said, there's a history of them, the Boule even blackballing me and whatnot. I don't care. I keep talking, right? I'm not gonna stop. So we'll just, know that.
Right. Absolutely. Sister Christina, I want to thank you really from the bottom of my heart coming on the Salt of the Earth channel today to kind of explain this fully. We did, as we always do, we spoke offline, we spoke backstage. And when this was first presented to me, I thought definitely this is something that we need to talk about. We need to bring out to people. We need to let people know it's out there as a jump off step. I think I said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again. Our prime identity lies with the Most High.
Absolutely.
And it is a Israelite identity that we are aiming for. And this is that step to get into the UN and kind of say, all right, these are separate groups, all over the place, all victims of chattel slavery in the Americas. But when we come together and describe who we are and what we are looking for, and I ask and I demand to let us go, that is what is going to unite us. So, sis, thank you again.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Anything you want to say to?
Yes. So for those of you that like to read late at night like myself, go to the website if you want to get very granular and look at each document and read it and then research things based off of that. Fact check, please do. Then definitely you can go there and spend your time doing that. But for everyone else, I just want you all to know, like, this is where we draw the line in the sand, spiritually, physically, and in every other aspect. Like, we are no longer, and I know you guys have been saying let my people go for a long time. I use that I use that same phrase too. Like, they're gonna let my people go. We are no longer building mercantile cities for Pharaoh. Okay. I am really adamant about that, because people will try to build off of our suffering and our backs and our conditions and our family divisions and elsewhere, and then make us feel guilty for asserting ourselves. But we're no longer doing that. We have entered into a whole new era. Call it a new realm. I used to watch Star Trek a lot, so forgive me if I sound a little Star Trek-ish, but that's what we're doing, and we're making this declaration, and we're not pulling it back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Bless you all.
Yep. Somebody's asking in the chat, and do you have a contact or a channel? I know that you have a channel because I'm on it. And
yeah.
Any other contact information that you'd like to share with fans?
Okay, a lot of you can look up my work. If you look up Christina Laster, Christina Christopher Laster, just Christina Laster on Google, you will be able to see ways to get in touch with me. You'll be able to see a history of years of work that I've done for Black children and families. You'll be able to see that I stand on business and my word when I talk about fighting for Black children and families through this policy and legislation space. You can find me on my Facebook, my Instagram, or Wise Society, which is going to be, I believe, on YouTube. It's at the Bold Authority, right? You're going to go at the Bold Authority, and you'll find my page. And otherwise, if you go on the UN submission website and look at the documents that I submitted, you'll see my email address and contact phone number there.
Excellent.
Don't be calling me about no.
You definitely had to put that in at the end, because you know they will be.
I'm not about to talk to you about your grandma's chocolate chip recipe, okay, cookie recipe, okay. I don't have that kind of time, even though I would love to partake in that kind of discussion. But listen, I love you all. We are a beautiful people. We need to be bold and courageous and have the confidence that our ancestors had, and seek the wisdom of the Most High, and follow the instruction of the Ruach. And so I am glad to be able to partake in this conversation, to be able to codify responses back into the codified system. And I look forward to this time. I'm glad we're here in an era that our ancestors would have loved to see and have prayed for. And so I am glad to be a part of this during this time. Bless you all.
Thank you. Thanks again, sis. All praises, glory, and honor be to the Most High. Fam, thank you so much for joining us on this Shabbat day. Go ahead and enjoy the rest of your Shabbat with your family and friends. And we here at Salt of the Earth will see you next time. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.